Por favor, si pueden subir a este escenario a Ayako Suwa, directora general de la Asociación de Banqueros Japoneses. La convocamos a la directora general de la Asociación de Banqueros Japoneses. Así también a Win Mix, director ejecutivo de la Federación Bancaria Europea. Lo convocamos. Así también a Anna Blick, ella es directora ejecutiva de la Asociación Bancaria Australiana. Y a Murli Bhagat, director ejecutivo de la Asociación de Bancos de la India. Y lo convocamos, por supuesto, al señor Giorgio Tretenero, secretario general de FELABAN, como moderador, quien nos dará, por supuesto, como corresponde, una introducción sobre este panel que aborda este tema relevante para el sistema a nivel global. Sean bienvenidos, por favor.
So, how do we see it? Can I see it?
Yes.
Muy bien, el señor Giorgio Tretenero, secretario general de FELABAN, como moderador.
Gracias. Buenos días a todos. Esta la voy a hacer en español. Para,
We speak Spanish?
para diversificar el mensaje.
Just a moment.
Mientras que se ponen, voy a hacer una pequeña introducción, ¿sí? En este panel vamos a tratar sobre los temas de ciberseguridad, y que son una preocupación para cualquier empresa, cualquier sector económico, en cualquier país, tanto en el sector financiero como en el bancario. No son ajenos a este tema, ya que esto representa pues un desafío para mantener la confianza del público, que al final la banca es confianza. Sin embargo, esto tiene múltiples dimensiones en términos de operación, cooperación entre sector y alineamiento del sector público y la supervisión financiera. You receive okay? Okay? Translation? ¿Sí? Okay. Según el Foro Económico Mundial, en el 2024, entre los 5 mega riesgos de los que enfrenta hoy día el mundo, los ciberataques ocupan el 5º lugar. Y la desinformación que puede generar la inteligencia artificial ocupa el 2º lugar. El tema es crucial y por ello la ciberseguridad y su prevención son cuestiones de máxima importancia estratégica el día de hoy en nuestro negocio. Son muchos los retos que hay que abordar, pero según diversos estudios y consultorías privadas, la banca debe tener en cuenta algunas cuestiones que, como se menciona a continuación. Uno, entender mejor las expectativas de los clientes, que cada vez lo quieren más rápido y instantáneo. Quieren la optimización de la experiencia desde los teléfonos, es una necesidad urgente, el uso de teléfonos. El manejo de las redes sociales para interactuar con el público es importante en la estrategia comercial el día de hoy. Y la omnicanalidad debe ser estudiada y atendida. Y, por último, los desafíos de seguridad siguen siendo una amenaza constante que puede erosionar pues, la confianza de los clientes, proveedores y mercados. Para tratar estos temas hemos invitado a los siguientes honorables invitados. Se conectó desde la India, Angarita, Mercedes. ¿India no está? ¿El Zoom? Bueno, perdimos a la India, creo que ya con cambio horario ya son las 12 de la noche. Pero nos acompaña la señora Ayako Suwa, San, presidenta de IBFED, directora general de la Asociación Banqueros Japoneses. Señor Win Mix, el director general de la Federación Bancaria Europea. Ana por esta hora que se demoró, tuvo que ir al aeropuerto. Anna Blick, que era directora de la Asociación Bancaria de Australiana, pero con mucho gusto, Anthony Foster, que trabaja muy de cerca con usted, nos va a acompañar, el presidente de la Asociación Bancaria de Canadá. Muchas gracias, Anthony. Entonces, quisiera comenzar con unas preguntas interesantes, una para todos. Empezamos por las damas. ¿Qué medidas toman los bancos para proteger a sus clientes de fraudes y estafas? ¿Qué papel puede jugar la educación financiera aquí en la solución de estos problemas? Ayako. Repito la pregunta. ¿Qué medidas toman los bancos para proteger a sus clientes de fraudes y estafas? ¿Y qué papel pueden jugar la educación financiera en la prevención de estos problemas?
So My name is Ayako Suwa. I'm from Japanese Bankers Association. And the question you asked is about the regulatory thing and also the customer protection or customer education. Am I correct?
La educación financiera, ¿cómo puede apoyar a la prevención de estos?
Okay. So as to the customer education, before I go into the subject, I want to talk about a little bit about the Japanese situation, which is quite different from Latin American countries. Japan is very much of a cash-oriented society yet, and especially for elderly people. And also people tend to put money in the high liquidity deposit like the ordinary account. So it's very easy for scammers to get money. I mean, it's very easy for them. And also in Japan, well, Anthony mentioned that 99% of the population have the bank account. And our, statistics say that 98. But it's very close. So almost everybody has the banking account. So that's the condition at the moment here in Japan. So as to the customer education, banks in Japan have been investing vast amounts of money and resources toward customer education protection from fraud and scams, as in other countries, of course. They install various preventive tools into their own system, perform strict checking of transaction purposes at teller windows at branches, or strict verification of the money sender in case of non-face-to-face transaction using the official identification number. Banks at the same time conduct various promotion campaigns or lectures to alert customers of the high risks and the most up-to-date tactics of fraud and scams. As a trade association for several years, the Japanese Bankers Association, JBA, on behalf of banks, has been conducting awareness campaigns using a variety of outreach with an extra focus on It's Me scams, where callers pretend to be a victim's son or grandson. Again, as we are the cash-oriented society, usually elderly people have their money at home because it's safe there. So the scammers, without using internet or any other products, they can just knock the door of the elderly people, pretend that they are the relatives of the person or the boss of the grandson, son, and get money. Of course, by the way, we encounter, with other sort of scams like internet, online banking scam, international romance scam, BEC, that's the business email compromises, and most recently, we have dramatical increase in the SNS-driven investment scam as well. So back to the It's Me scam. We have conducted promotional activities at events such as a concert for the past few years. We are making video advertisements, putting notice on the JBA website, around ATMs or bank branches, and various other means. We also offer free of charge educational lectures to schools, senior groups, and other sectors explaining about types of fraud and scams and how to prevent trouble and such. And I know EBF has been doing a very good job for that. By offering these lectures, we believe that the knowledge and awareness we share with attendees will allow them to be more aware of the current scams and protect against them. These awareness campaigns are for everyone, but especially those over 65, and also teenagers who may have grandparents. We feel it is very important, especially for It's Me scam, that family members are aware of these scams and the scammers' tactics. If family members can communicate freely in their daily life, it would be effective in preventing victims from handing out cash or remitting money on ATMs or to be victimized with new types of scams. This year, as I mentioned previously, we are focusing on awareness campaign on the SNS-driven investment scams and making a video alerting the audience of tactics and of the countermeasures people should be aware of. Although more cases of scams are being prevented, in reality, there has been an increase in the number of cases due to advanced technology, as well as cunning and new tactics that scammers have. So all these measures play a very important role in visualizing the latest situation surrounding fraud, raising awareness of recipients, and letting them know that it might happen to themselves, not to somebody else. So therefore, we believe that it's very essential that we continue our customer education efforts to raise awareness.
Muy interesante lo que comenta ya con lo que pasa en Japón. Igual para Wing, en Europa hay algo diferente.
Ladies and gentlemen, what a pleasure to be here today, and indeed cybersecurity is something that concerns all of us. So thank you, Giorgio, for the questions. I will try to answer them indeed one by one, because we are all united, so the situation in Japan is similar to the situation in Europe. But if you think about your questions, what are the main threats as the first question, then what are banks doing about it as the second, and then how do we help the public, how do we deal with financial education and awareness? Now the first is, last Friday I was in Madrid and I was in the cybersecurity center of Santander, the worldwide cybersecurity. And it looks a little bit like this. It has these huge screens on which you can see the whole world, including Latin America. And if I may share some of the things that I saw there to start, first, there is threat level 1. Because one thing that we have in Europe is we have a war in Ukraine after the invasion by Russia. So there is a constant attempt to attack critical infrastructure everywhere in Europe, from Spain to Finland, everywhere. So this is the first. The second one, and you can easily see the threat level and the different attacks, is that the ransomware gangs and ransomware as a service are all over the place. One of the things that really worries us about this is ransomware in the more liquidity-sensitive parts of a bank, but I will come back to that. And the third is state-sponsored attacks. You realize there is, of course, a war on the European continent, but also other countries are trying to use their capability to try to either penetrate, attack, or disrupt banks and other critical infrastructure. So that is the threat level. That is quite serious. Now, what are we doing about it? The first is cooperation. The European Banking Federation has organized CIO roundtables where we have the heads of intelligence of the banks working together. But this is, of course, after everything that is already happening at national level and state-sponsored level. But we also work very closely with the European Central Bank to try and work together and see how threats develop. So that is the level where what banks are doing. And if I now make the bridge to how we work with scams, that has a lot to do. There's a huge difference between when banks started entering strong customer authentication. You saw that the number of, I would say, technical penetration went down immediately, but that means that the biggest threat now towards citizens is social engineering. And that leads me to the third question of Giorgio, what are we doing? And financial education always helps and is important on many levels, and we should do that. But what works here very well, and many countries are doing that, are awareness campaigns. Very simple awareness campaigns. Your bank will never call you. Your bank will never ask for your credentials. Your bank will never send somebody for your PIN code. Nevertheless, if you look at the level of sophistication, there is still a lot to be done, but I will leave that for later in the discussion, because these scams, and certainly with the help of AI, get more and more sophisticated.
Anthony.
Yeah, thanks, Giorgio. I forgot to mention this in the last panel, but just all of us at the IBFED have really enjoyed yesterday and today, and just want to thank Giorgio for he and his team for organizing such a great conference. I'm sure you all appreciate it, but it's a real joy to be here. We've loved being in Paraguay and getting to know everyone in Latin America, so thank you. What's interesting, obviously Anna Bly had to leave for her flight, which is unfortunate, but if we kind of think about it, I'm going to structure it a little differently from your questions, but basically I want to build on what's been discussed here. How does social engineering happen? Often the bad actors have sophisticated systems. They're going into the dark web, pulling information on people and that kind of stuff. Well, how could they get information? Open banking. So if a country implements open banking and doesn't make sure there's good safeguards and such in place for those fintechs or other entities that are getting that information, what happens? That information is up in the dark web. Then you can phone up a grandmother or whoever, a single woman that is looking for a date, and fool them into giving away their credentials because you have enough information in the dark web to convince them that you're either a knowledgeable authority or whatever it is that you're doing. And the other thing is how do you facilitate or make it easier for the scammers? You have instant settlement. So countries that have put in real-time rails or advanced payment systems, if the money moves like that, there's no delay or any sort of friction in the system, it's very quickly moved. And so what's happened around the world, countries that have put in open banking without good controls of the consumer's data and real-time rail systems, as the scam rates have gone through the roof, 100%, 200% increases. And so unfortunately for Australia, they implemented both those systems and saw their scams go through the roof. And what was interesting in Australia was the government pretty quickly realized that this was an ecosystem issue because there could be fake websites on a Facebook website, like a Facebook marketplace, or someone could be receiving a text or a phone call, and they were being fooled into giving away the credentials and sending the money and that kind of stuff. And so the government said, hey, we're going to create an environment where you all have to work together to make a better system and protection of consumers. And additionally, they then put also a significant effort into educating those consumers. So it's quite amazing, what they learned, but that was in some ways kind of, I'm not sure if you know the expression, closing the barn door after the animals have bolted the barn. Like it's, they're coming to it after the fact. And thankfully in Canada, we have open banking yet to come soon, and we have real-time rail yet to come, but not too far after that. And so we've been able to learn and study what's going on in Australia. That's why I'm willing to talk a bit about what Anna and the Australian Bankers Association have experienced, because the Canadian Bankers Association has spent considerable resources studying what's happened in Australia, and we're trying to get ahead of the curve. And so we now have a voluntary system of an alliance between banks, telecoms, and big tech and the government agencies, and we've started working on a process so that we'll have better controls, data information sharing, other elements in place before open banking and real-time rail are turned on. Not that it will solve all the problems, but unfortunately their misfortune we've really leveraged and learned from it. But so if you're worried about your countries, the Australian model is something that I would highly recommend you study. And there's consulting firms, we work with Deloitte as an example, that have studied it closely and have a lot of great information that could help you get up to speed if you're worried about your country's environment. Anyway, hopefully that's helpful.
Muchas gracias, muy interesante, Anthony, en la versión de los tres. Pero ahora quiero aprovechar que está Anthony para hacerle otra pregunta. Anthony, ¿hay algún impacto en términos de ciberseguridad por la irrupción de las fintechs y las big tech financieras? ¿Qué impacto? ¿Cómo está afectando a la industria?
So on the fintech side, I don't have the stats, but what is interesting is Canada had set up a cybercrime threat exchange that has the payment system, the banks, telecoms and such working together, and that's coming at it from the bigger picture, obviously like the state actors and other organized elements. And so as part of that, because we have Payments Canada, the payment system involved in that, The payment service providers that work and engage with them would be captured in that process. But the actual underlying fintechs are not that robust, and so it's more trying to protect and stop stuff coming through the payment system. And the risk is obviously what we don't know is the consumer data. And so in Canada, because we don't have open banking, a lot of Canadians that have digital banking information, they want to use a fintech, they do what's called screen scraping. So they go and give their credentials to a fintech to then have that bot or whatever go and pull their information and pull it into the fintech. We have had significant instances where that information has been leaked, but it's not always been cyber. Interesting, Giorgio, often it's rogue employees. They know the encryption or whatever, they're not as good controls because they're smaller companies. So the employees steal that credential information and then get the money. And then they get mad at the banks, but they're the ones that did the screen scraping, right? So one of the reasons why Canadian Bankers Association would like to have open banking in Canada is actually to get rid of screen scraping, because having people, asking people to give out their bank card and passcode information and having that all over the internet is a significant risk and a big concern of ours. And the government of Canada has acknowledged that, and so they have said that they will look at screen scraping through time. And I would expect that as open banking opens up in Canada, screen scraping will be reduced, and that at least will reduce one vector. And then the other question will be is, because we haven't seen the final legislation, is how well they regulate the fintechs that receive information through open banking. You know, and who will have liability for the data that when it passes from a bank to a fintech or another entity is an open question that hasn't been answered yet in Canada. Hopefully it'll pass with the data, and therefore there'll be a higher standard requirement whatever entity receives the data. But that's not been clarified yet in Canada. Is that helpful?
Ese punto es muy importante, Anthony, porque al final el cliente cede los datos y dice yo quiero una banca open banking, entonces ¿quién es responsable de lo que pasa con datos si hay puertas falsas o estas empresas no tienen las mismas seguridades que tenemos hoy? Y al final vienen de regreso mediante un ataque o un fraude al banco. ¿Quién debería pagar al final la cuenta? El consumidor, el banco, las fintechs, y por eso nosotros insistimos, una misma actividad financiera tiene que tener una misma regulación y un mismo sistema de seguridad, porque si no hay un riesgo de pérdida de credibilidad del sistema. Aquí yo tengo una pregunta para Wim. La Unión Europea es muy diversa. La IBFED está organizando la cooperación entre bancos en materia de ciberseguridad a nivel europeo. ¿Y cómo cooperan con el Banco Central Europeo?
Yeah. Thank you very much. And indeed, if you look at Europe and the countries of the European Union, you see that at national level they are very used, and they have set up national cybersecurity centers, and they work closely together. The advantage of the banking sector is that we were always under cyber attack much earlier than other critical infrastructures, because bank robbers go where the money is, and if it's not on the vault, it's online, so that's where they go. Now, you saw over the last years, I would say since 2014, 2015, you saw the European Central Bank also take an interest. And I will tell you a little story about how that started, because the ECB, as our supervisor, first thought mostly on reporting on cyber incidents. So they kept asking us to fill out a questionnaire within 2 hours of a cyber incident. And we said, as collective European Bank Federation, we said together with the banks, this will not help for 2 reasons. First, 2 hours after the attack, we are still fighting the attack and not ready to report on it. And second, you are in a dual role as ECB, because you need to realize that in cybersecurity, you not only are supervisor, but the European Central Bank is a prime target for cyber criminals. And it took them about 2 years to get to that. I will tell you a small scandalous story. Some of my colleagues were so annoyed, and they are pretty good in technicians, so they did a red team test on the reporting pipeline of the ECB. and we offered that report, which was not very good because it was not very safe, to the ECB, and suddenly we were able to work together. Now, since then, we have made significant progress because the ECB itself realized that the specialists are in the financial sector, the cybersecurity specialists. So we work with, as I said, with the CEOs. We have twice a year, we have a meeting on threat level, on what's coming on the horizon, what we see, and we have the technicians of the ECB there. So that's the first successful one. The second successful example is a project that I would like to mention that is on ransomware a ransomware attack to the treasury. And the premise of that was as follows. Everybody in the financial sector has studied the Aeon attack and realized that if you have a ransomware attack and you pay immediately, by the way, this is an illegal statement because officially you're not supposed to pay ransomware, but as you all know, if you're in tech, almost everybody does. It takes about 10 to 13 days in the case of Aeon to become operational directly after the payments. Now, we in Europe measured that our treasury has 2 days liquidity. That means that you have a direct problem if you have a ransomware attack on your treasury. And we are closely working with ECB together on some kind of a list of remedies or possible remedies in the case of a direct attack on our liquidity. So that is for me these are one of the big measures and projects that we do, and it shows how important cooperation is, not only in your own country, but also at a full European level and closely with your supervisors and regulators and authorities.
Interesantísimo, Wim. Aquí hay una pata más que hay que analizar, ¿no? Contaba Rob en el panel anterior de que para firmar un crédito hipotecario tenía que firmar 1 tonelada de papeles. Entonces he vivido esa experiencia varias veces. Entonces, y hoy día si ustedes quieren firmar algo, usted quiere aceptar en Amazon un contrato y le llega lleno, usted diga acepto, y pasan las páginas y pone acepto. Después usted fue responsable de no sé cuál de esas 10.000 páginas que usted firmó. Entonces ahí le pregunto esta pregunta a todos, pero empiezo por Ayako, San. Dada la creciente complejidad de la infraestructura bancaria con múltiples proveedores y vendedores que nos ofrecen servicios a los bancos, ¿cómo recomiendas tú gestionar mejor los riesgos de terceros?
Yes, that's something very troublesome. And in Japan, we try to control the third party and try to avoid the risk management, the risk, of course. And the Japanese Financial Service Agency last December actually examined the case of the U.S. Financial institutions because they are the very advanced institution. And we are still in an emerging period for this third-party risk management. So the government analyzed the U.S. financial institution, how they control third party, and we compiled the report called the Survey Report on Third-Party Supply Chain Cybersecurity Risk Management in the Financial Sector. Unfortunately, that's only in Japanese. So the result of the research stated that various important implications throughout the Japanese financial institution that we can study from. And we need to deeply understand the cyber risks in the third-party supply chain at first point, and develop the global framework and schemes for risk management, of course, and promote human resources development. And those are the very fundamental things. But in Japan, we're still in the process of doing those things step by step. But of course, third-party risk management and how to control is very important and critical issue, I think.
Y por el mismo ejemplo, pero con un pequeño añadido, para darle un poco de sabor al tema. Hoy día trabajamos mucho la banca con las nubes, ¿no? En las nubes. Y cuando hay un problema en la nube, al final nunca hay problemas de ninguna nube. Siempre fue un problema de los bancos porque siempre encuentran una cláusula o subcláusula dentro del contrato que dice y al final la responsabilidad no es de la nube. Entonces, adicionalmente a la pregunta, hay esa variante que Europa, ¿cómo lo está viendo? ¿Cómo lo está trabajando?
I think that Europe passed a lot of digital legislation, and one that was very good and useful and potentially useful is DORA, and not DORA the Explorer, but the Digital Operational Resilience Act. And that is specifically looking at the resilience of the bank and the use of cloud, but other third parties as well. Now, we believe that in the core that is good legislation, the attempt to look differently at banks and have a look more towards the future, that the bank will not have its own mainframe computers anymore, but will outsource to the cloud and will use many other third parties, that makes sense. The problem is, exactly as you say, Giorgio, our definition of where the responsibility is and where in the cloud. So this needs to be fleshed out. The DORA is going into force the 17th of January 2025, but the interesting thing is that banks are struggling to prepare and to separate and to visualize all the contracts that are out there. And that is bad. We have one advantage. Our supervisor is equally struggling and has already announced that they do not have the right people at the moment to supervise DORA. But that means that even if you do the things right, as you said, if you try to envision a future bank with all their data in the cloud and third parties and different way, everything digital, that means that you have to give the time to get ready, not only to the banks themselves on how to deal with this new world, but also to the supervisors on how to supervise. And I would say, watch Europe in 2025 because we will be struggling with it.
So I don't have necessarily a regulatory view on that, but I do have an operational view. Prior to running the Canadian Bankers Association, I was living in Boston working for a bank called State Street. I'm not sure if many people know who State Street is, but they're a global systemic important bank. And their role is essentially as a custodian, being a bank to banks and large pension funds and investment companies and such. And I serviced I was running the operations of one of the largest clients. And that client, I had $2.5 trillion of assets under custody administration that we had to value every day. We had to track all the money in and out, money laundering, all the different things. But if you picture globally trying to value $2.5 trillion in securities on a daily basis, you have a lot of processes, different things. You have all the movements, you have the dividends, you have special actions, you have redemptions, additions. Like there's always a ton of stuff going on. And State Street, obviously, like Bank of New York Mellon or JP Morgan, has developed a lot of systems through time, and also a lot of acquisitions. And so it can be kind of clunky. For our client, we moved processes that were on servers to the cloud, and we were able to reduce our errors by 99%. And so although there are risks and issues about putting stuff in the cloud, what it did was what I discovered a lot of our errors came from employees. And so we have employees doing processes, and when you have all your processes on servers and then at desktops, if they go on vacation and don't update their computer and then they run the daily close, they could do a little error. Well, the problem is that $2.5 trillion, a little error magnified by volume can actually be a real operational loss. And if you think about Basel and the capital rules, operational risk is actually a very expensive form of capital. And you have an operational loss, that stays on the books for years. There's a long tail on that. And so if you can clean up your processes, move stuff to the cloud, then when you make a change in a process or whatever, it's once done, everyone's got the same process. You can also more quickly, if you have an issue, more quickly update it because you're not waiting for someone to come back from a vacation and become kind of your lowest common denominator. Anyway, it was incredible. Our ratings with our client, we went from being below average to being the highest rated custodian for that client. But more importantly, because we were able to cut the errors, our expenses dropped quite rapidly, and so it's also expanded our margins. And so going to the cloud from an operational perspective, if you're doing it carefully and you take it as an opportunity to look at your processes, clean them up, automate them, get as much straight-through processing, it's just as good hygiene and a valuable thing. And so obviously there may be systems risk, you may be reliant on an AWS or a Google or whoever you may want to use. But the reality is if you purposefully leverage it, it's an incredible operational benefit.
Yep.
And the other thing that we did was, because 2.5 trillion obviously was stuff all around the world, we created 3 instances of the cloud, and so we could hand off and do stuff, but we could also, because of that, we could preload stuff as the sun went around the world, essentially. Instead of trying to do everything at once, you know, at 4 o'clock Eastern, you know, the computers would all slow down when everyone was trying to do stuff across the company. Well, if we can preload stuff, it's less of a damage. So there's also, there's a lot of things you can do creatively, depending on what you're doing operationally with the cloud, that was really valuable. So that's a little sidebar, but I found it amazing.
It is the future.
Yeah.
Interesantísimo. Yo quería hacer una pregunta a Wim para cambiar un poco el tema, pero importante. Yo observo que todo el mundo habla del fraude de pagos, se enfoca en los pagos. ¿No es entonces ya no es más un fraude tecnológico? O sea, ¿quién debería participar en la lucha contra el fraude y las estafas en línea, Wim?
Thank you very much for that question, and I'm very happy to be here, because I cannot imagine in a room full of bankers that anybody is talking about payment fraud, because it is not. So again, we had in Europe we had a large fraud seminar, and it shows that one of the things that is so worrying is, yes, if there is intrusion in the payment system, which we do everything we can to stop, that is our responsibility. But the social engineering starts somewhere else. And the problem here is that it is now being seen as push payment fraud. And this is the friendly people who either send you a text saying, Dad, I have a new phone, my phone was stolen, please transfer 300 euros. Or the people that call elderly people at home and say, hello, you need your bank credentials need to be changed, and all these evil things. The problem is, it is so hard for a bank to see that that is not an unauthorized payment, that we see it as an authorized payment. So what is wrong here is if we are creating an atmosphere or legislation that puts the full liability with the bank, that also leads to an automated reimbursement. That leads to, first, it's wrong, because we are at the end of the transaction as bank sector. Second, it creates a moral hazard if you know that whatever you do online will automatically be reimbursed. So who do you need to get in? And for me that is obvious. You need the social media platforms. If you look at Meta, who is interested to help with prevention, but are less interested to take their role in liability, and if you see the amount of fraud on places like Facebook Marketplace, I believe they should. That's one. The second is the telecoms industry, because the number of spoofed phone numbers, but also the burner phones, and the telecoms industry sees the numbers that are used in fraud. And they always tell us that they do not want to intrude in the private conversations, but they don't have to, and I as a banking representative am also not interested in the private conversations, but I am interested in taking down the telephone numbers that are used for fraud. So in long answer to your very short question, it is not payment fraud. It is tech fraud or online fraud or whatever you want to call it. And we need to closely cooperate with the social media platforms in the widest sense. And the telecom industry needs to take its responsibility in the giving out of numbers and the burning votes. And of course, banks also have their role, but we already are playing it.
Yeah, can I add to that, Giorgio?
Yep.
So I think what Vim is getting at, if you think about it, which is really, it's part of it is nomenclature in Canada, we've been educating people to call it scams. So when someone is fooled out of their money, so it's not a fraud, because fraud would suggest it's happened inside the bank. So scams, and it's the same thing in Australia, they call it scams as well. But often that bleeds, and different cultures maybe may not translate well into Portuguese or Spanish, I don't know. But trying to separate the two and make it clear that that's a scam, because if you think about it, there have been con artists as long as there's been money, right? So you could go back 2,000 years, there's always been con artists. They just learn different channels of scamming people. So they're always conning people, they're always filling out their money. It's just far easier for them to now do that, given how much expansion we've given of digital services to people. And so just thinking about that nomenclature is incredibly important. And then by doing that, then you're able to lift it up and go, okay, so if in a digital world people are being scammed more, where is that digital information? It's not just the fact that money can be sent by e-transfer. It's the fact that, as we have said, is obviously we're looking at the phone calls, the texts, the Facebook marketplaces of the world, what that is leading to that. And I think that what's interesting, again, studying Australia, the government realized after they'd done open banking and real-time rail, they needed to do something. So they made telecom, social media, big tech, and the banks come together. And they also made, instead of doing a liability model that didn't include the consumers, they also have, kind of like similar to an insurance thing, they have an at-fault element to the consumer. If the consumer was willingly doing stuff and clicking through all the things you need to do, saying that they wanted to send the money, they have a fair amount of responsibility. Currently in Canada, if the consumer is scammed, the consumer is 100% liable for the scam. Although in certain instances the banks may reimburse them, but there's no requirement in Canada. That may change through time, but we'll see how that models. But so.
Muy interesante. Eso me lleva a un caso, vimos en el directorio pasado, y es público, lo puedo comentar, el caso chileno. En Chile se creó una regulación en la cual, aun si el cliente, o sea, que el cliente podía reclamar este cargo, yo no lo hice, y el banco tenía que pagar en 4 días solo con el reclamo, a menos que demostrara no solamente que lo hizo adrede, sino además que había intencionalidad. ¿Y eso qué cosa generó? Generó pues que el autofraude creciera 10 veces en Chile. Entonces, ¿me entienden? Entonces eso hizo que el producto tarjeta de crédito fuera un producto menos atractivo. Gracias a Dios se logró cambiar esa regulación e invertir esa mala decisión. A veces uno apuesta mucho por cliente, pero el mercado es el mercado y la gente que trabaja de manera no adecuada aprovecha cualquier punto oscuro o no claro para sacar partido. Entonces yo aprovecho esta pregunta para una pregunta a todos, pero a Yako-san me gustaría que nos defina. Entonces, en función a todo esto que hemos conversado, ¿qué desafíos regulatorios observa? ¿Cómo impactan las regulaciones en su país en la capacidad de los bancos para combatir el fraude? ¿Y qué cambios le gustaría a Japón que se realizaran?
So as to the regulatory field, in 2007, we set the Act on Prevention of Transfers of Criminals Proceed, and to combat fraud at the bank level, to check various points in the opening of bank accounts, or to check whether the business for the fund transfer actually is a genuine one, among other things. However, we still see the increase in cases of fraud and scam, whichever you call it, with the advanced technologies scanning method taken by criminals. So in 2024, this year, in June, a committee consisting of all the cabinet ministers published comprehensive measures to prevent people in Japan from fraud. And in a nutshell, there are 3 main issues or measures that are indicated in these comprehensive measures. First, it describes stronger prevention measures for illegal use of deposit. Second, it illustrates measures for the freezing of deposit accounts used for fraud or scams. And thirdly, it's a new measure it indicates the preventive measures against the withdrawal and transfer of money by criminal groups. So please remember, that 98% of the Japanese population have one or more bank accounts. So to stop the fraud using the bank account is very useful and effective. So following the publication of these comprehensive measures, we, together with the National Police Agency and the Financial Service Agency, our control agency, are working on various measures, such as to limit the amount of the withdrawal and remittance using ATMs, especially for elderly, or to be stricter for the personal identification method and such. So to combat fraud, we eagerly wait for these comprehensive measures to be implemented and in practice. And we, of course, will put our best effort toward activating that. And so I think that those are the regulatory environment we are seeing now.
En Europa, Wim, ¿cómo lo ves?
Giorgio, I don't think that it is very strange to ask to a representative of the European Union to think if he can think of more regulation. I believe that is the main export product of Europe, to be honest. Please, if there's anybody from the European Union listening, no. But having said that, there is some good regulation, as I already said, and so the key is in using that regulation in the best possible way. And one of the arguments that we always make is we need to start at what the aim of all this regulation is. What's the objective? And the objective is to protect our citizens and our economy from bad actors, from fraud, from gangsters, and from organized crime. And if you then think on what we can do to make that regulation work, then the first thing that comes to my mind is better cooperation among countries, but also among the private law enforcement, private sector and public sector, and better use of data. Often in Europe, the GDPR, the data protection regulation, is used as saying that's why we can't do it. But the problem is actually not in the data protection regulation itself. The problem is in the data protection authorities who have a tunnel vision in the use of data. And one of the things that I asked them, and that would be my dream, is you don't have to tell me what is data protection or what is data privacy. I can read that in the law. But you have to help us in creating the balance between the use of data to protect society and citizens from organized crime and data privacy. And they have been awfully silent because that is not an easy legal question. So that would be my first wish. The second wish would be indeed to have in the payment service regulation a clear provision that social media platforms and telecoms and banks need to work closely together and are jointly liable on dealing with fraud towards citizens. So the cooperation needs to be closer between the different actors in scams, but also with the authorities. And the third would be, and that is where I see a role for all of us, but including for the banks, is to do awareness campaigns, because in my view, the opportunities of going digital are vast. In principle, going into a cloud is safer. The use of data in the best way will lead to better services, but it also means that our citizens, that the European consumers need to be very well aware of that they can be scammed, and that is where we need the awareness campaigns. So I have a dream, but that dream is not regulation.
Antes de pasarle a Anthony.
Yeah, so I'm a firm believer in less regulation is better, and I'm hoping that we're in post-peak regulatory and capital requirements globally. Hopefully we're coming out on the other side of that thing, but we'll see. Hopefully that'll come out of one of the legacies of Donald Trump. But so it's interesting. In Australia, they implemented what was called the Mandatory Scams Code Framework. So it was mandatory, but there wasn't a heavy amount of legislation. But the key thing about it was It was ecosystem-wide and had sector-specific obligations for businesses to prevent, detect, disrupt, and respond to scams. So that meant the telecoms, social media, any player that was a vector or an avenue for scams to occur, all of a sudden had a mandatory obligation to do stuff to respond. And as part of that, they then created an anti-scam alliance, bringing all those parties together. They furthermore liberalized their privacy rules because they realized, like in Canada or EU or elsewhere, where a lot of these privacy rules were put in place, what they didn't realize was they were doing more to protect bad actors than anyone else. Like the average citizen isn't doing stuff that needs, rock solid privacy protection because there isn't things there. But if you're a bad actor, having that rock solid privacy protection is a fantastic way to operate. And so in Australia, they actually put in distinct things in the legislation to allow sharing of information across sectors and companies to when they felt it was a result of a scam. Now, they put in things in place to protect identities and such, because often people are in that information. There would be people that were victims, but you need to be able to track where, how was the victim, what was the vector in? Was it a text, a phone call, whatever? So you need to know who the victim was, and where did they send the money? Where was the mule account, and how those things happened, or what was the former process? What was the dollar amount? So there's certain things that need to be tracked, but you could keep the victim's identity hidden. But more importantly, you could perhaps in that situation discover that maybe the same burner phone has done the same social engineering and called the same 10 different grandmothers across the country. What looked like in different cities as 10 different individual scams was actually one playbook. And that money was sent by those 10 grandmothers to the same mule account. And you go, okay, their burner phone is in this building and that mule account is in this city, whatever. Often, sadly, they're outside of the country. And so that's a whole other issue. And really, there's a broader international law enforcement issue. But so that's quite interesting, because I think Australia, even though they let the horse bolt the barn and then close the barn door, what they are doing is the reality is even though open banking and instant settlement had made it riper, or made them a bit of a honeypot, they actually realized, well, scams are always going to happen. We can't fix what happened in the past, but we can try and stop happening in the future. And they have made substantial progress with this effort and this attitude and this approach of coordination. In Canada, our privacy rules are unlikely to change. As I mentioned earlier, we have a bit of a hung parliament. There's not much going on. I'd be shocked if we could get legislative stuff. But there is avenues. We were able to get the law changed from a money laundering perspective and creating an environment for cooperation. And so we're going to use that same sort of concept to, if there's a bad actor doing something, that we will then try and do information exchange. So what we're doing right now with the Anti-Scam Alliance that we launched, we've got 5 work streams. One of them is a data and information sharing. And so we're looking at what are the different use cases that we want to share information, and then we're going to do what's called a privacy impact assessment. So look at our privacy laws and what can we do. We're going to get legal opinion instead of going to the regulator. We're going to get a legal opinion, and then that's going to bear opinion. And if the regulator tries to go after us, we're going to say, no, we got one of the best privacy lawyers in the country, said we can do it. But the flip side is we have a huge problem in Canada, and I think this is common elsewhere, is law enforcement has not done a lot to try and fight these bad actors. I think some of it's because it's international, but the other part is, as I described, the 10 different grandmothers getting ripped off or whatever it is. They don't see it as one player, and that's partly our fault. And I don't just mean banks, but businesses that are involved in that value chain of experience need to work better to get information in hand to law enforcement so they see it's actually one bad actor doing that playbook or whatever it is, so that we can then actually go after them. And even if we determine they're outside the country, then we could learn, if we figure that out, then we figure out how they're getting the money of the country. Maybe we turn off those pipes or those different elements and get a better understanding of the playbook and how they're operating. And so I think that you don't have to have the mandatory approach that Australia did. In Canada, I have, as the head of the Canadian Bankers Association, have gotten the telecoms and big tech and government to come together. I'm leading the initiative. It's all voluntary. But once you say, hey, we want to protect Canadians, everyone's going, yeah, I agree, we need to protect Canadians. And so I've found it's a bit of a pushing on an open door. Everyone's welcoming, and now it's a matter of getting, traction and ideas, but we're also working on education and awareness. We're thinking about systems technology. We're putting a special program to work with the digital platforms to see how we can more rapidly pull down fake sites and that kind of stuff. And then we're also thinking about the longer term strategy, because the reality is scams are never going away, right? It's been going on for thousands of years. There's just new avenues. And so when we develop new techniques or processes, they'll get more sophisticated. We have AI coming. And so it's really important, the more we do, the better off we're going to be, because it's going to get harder and harder. And their return on investment is huge. Often their costs are some computer stuff and trying to get a mule account. And so often they'll purchase mule accounts from foreign students that are leaving the country that have a legitimate account, and they take the account over or something. How they get the mule accounts is often their biggest cost of business. But once they have a mule account, until it gets caught, they're able to make a lot of money. So there's a lot of different elements there, but the reality is I think, being encouraged to approaching your other sectors that are involved would be an important thing, and thinking about how to voluntarily do stuff is important, because then you can shape the outcomes and work pragmatically. If you rely on your government to mandate it, it's unlikely they're going to be sophisticated enough or nimble enough to help you solve the problems.
Gracias, Anthony. Yo pensaba en cómo ha cambiado el mundo de la seguridad, de la ciberseguridad. ¿Quién de ustedes no ha recibido un mail de Netflix? Su cuenta ha sido bloqueada. Por favor, envíe sus datos y la página es exactamente igual a la original. O un mensaje de Amazon que su paquete ha llegado pero su dirección no la recibe. Por favor, complete la información. Y hasta uno llega a dudar, uno que sabe de esto, uno llega y duda, dice, ¿será verdad? Llega al nivel, ¿no? O eso viene hasta un chiste. Su clave ha caducado, esta es verdad, 30 días, cambia la clave. No, esta clave se parece a las últimas 14 que ha puesto, ahora tiene que ponerla con mayúscula. No, ahora y no se olvide que una mayúscula, una minúscula y un bicho para que confunda. No se olvide de la exclamación o el punto de interrogación. No, debe tener ahora 12 porque yo me imagino cómo será esto cuando venga pues la computación cuántica. O sea que hoy día quiero hacer una transferencia y tengo poner mi clave, la última, me llega un cheque, más aún, cuando mi señora quiere encontrarme, ¿qué hace mi señora? Hace 2 consumos rápidos en tarjeta, yo la llamo, ya te robaron la tarjeta, ya sé que mi señora ahí me contesta, ya sé por el SMS que me llega de información. Y con la computación cuántica, yo tengo un token, y el token que me llega con un SMS, y tengo 2 confirmaciones, voy. Esto va a estar en evolución y en continuo cambio, y estos delincuentes, cuando ya salió la computación cuántica, esto nos va a cambiar además todo el concepto de seguridad interna, no que este modelo cambie. Se nos venció el tiempo, ya son las 2:02, no quiero matarles el almuerzo, que deben estar todos con hambre, ya me están mirando ahí muy hambrientos, muy agradecido a Jaco de Japón,
They're staring at you because you're sitting on the podium, Giorgio.
Anthony, gracias a todos. Un aplauso para los señores, por favor.